Good morning, my name is Pat Gwyer, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'd like to introduce my colleague Phoebe Kingston to talk about some of her interests and experiences in mental health systems. I met you in New York. We were at an international conference on mindfulness and therapeutic approaches, and you gave an absolutely amazing presentation about your experience, and I think you really did wow the audience, and I did come up to you afterwards to speak to you about that. I think when you finished, your impact was so great, you could have heard a pin drop in the room.
Oh, thank you, Pat. You're very kind.
Just summarise, what is it that motivates you?
You know, in real estate, we say location, location, location. With me, it's passion, passion, passion. And if you're going to work in the mental health space, you really have to be a people person. You've got to be a humanist, and you've got to be genuinely committed to improving the lives, of others. And it doesn't matter which perspective that passion comes from, as long as there's a commitment to it at all levels. I just want to use my experiences to help improve things, for others, and that's a really genuine commitment. And to advocate and really be a change agent for reform in the system, because I'm often in a privileged position where I am giving a representative voice. But I actually have 5 values that drive all of my work. And the first one is that I'm incredibly passionate about the deliverance of the consumer voice to executive levels. I believe in consumer and stakeholder accountability and transparency in our mental health services. I really value robust consumer representation, consumer engagement, and the principle that all health service stakeholder voices are acknowledged as equal and valued. And at the end of all that, I'm really committed to consumer activism and the consumer movement. I'm always mindful of our forebears who endured so much and some real atrocities in psychiatry, and these people have fought very hard for our rights. At Curtin, we always refer to them as the giants whose shoulders we stand on. And so those are my 5 core principles that pretty much drive everything I do.
It sounds like part of your role and part of your mission and your passion is to help change that process, so it's a continually growing and organic process. And one of the things that really appealed to me when I met you in New York is I could see the value of you talking to mental health practitioners. I could see you talking to them much more as peers, and I was wondering if, instead of sitting opposite somebody as a service user or as a patient, they actually had a conversation as an equal. It would really help reduce that discrimination. And that they say that communication and engagement is the key to addressing things like stigma and oppression and things like that, getting people to talk and challenging their own prejudices, their own stereotypes, their own assumptions. And sometimes we're not even aware of the assumptions. But if we only talk to people as I am the expert and this is the treatment you're going to receive, I don't think we change that dialogue. And it sounds like that's something that you're doing and really focusing on well with great vigor.
Yeah, because there is a massive power imbalance, in our system. And I don't know that everyone's aware of it and what levels they're aware of it, but it's certainly there. And there's a phrase, and it goes like this: if you can't feel power, then you're the person who's got it. Because it's everybody else who is struggling and not having power and not having a voice that feel the weight that scale's, tipping away from their favor all the time. And I don't know if you've ever looked at it, Pat, but the Gaventa's power cube. Now, this is just a wonderful visual of, it's sort of like a 4-dimensional, some barriers are there, but they're invisible. Some, there's global, there's national, there's local, there's invited spaces, there's claimed spaces, there's shared spaces. And I'm very aware of, all these power dynamics, and it's something I'd really like to shift. And you're right, let's do things side by side, you know, in this very mutual, power sharing way would be a real change, a significant change, yeah.
And you know, I think you're right. And when you said about not being aware of the power, it really made me think about just how you do need to be really tuned into that sense of power. And it's very easy to miss it. And, you know, if I'm used to being the expert and I'm used to being accountable and maybe accountable from a statutory position, then to work with you equally, you know, I may come from that position of being much more powerful. And if the person I'm working with is used to being ignored, if they're feeling hopeless, if they're feeling helpless in their recovery, in their journey, in where they're moving forward to, it can often be very, very implicit. And we just probably adopt these roles without really being aware for it. And it made me wonder if I'm not sure if you do this, but I could imagine you doing a reflective practice with clinicians where you led that reflective practice would be a really good opportunity to help them reflect and to help them think about what that shift is like. And that'd be interesting, because if you facilitated a reflective practice, in a way, you're in the position of power, you're coming with the expert, and it might be interesting to get people to tune into what they notice and how it makes them feel when they're in this very different position. I'm aware of the time, and you know, I'm sure that you're very busy and have things to do. As well is for you to maybe talk about some of the things that you'd like to see happen in service reform, either in Western Australia, where that's going to be your area of expertise and knowledge, but also anything else that you could think, you know, people listening from other parts of the world, if they were designing a service and developing a service, or wanting to make that service as effective as possible, what sort of things do you think would be really helpful to be aware of and to include?
And number one is that it became sort of painfully apparent to me after years of my own lived experience and hearing the lived experience of others, that when an individual presents to a mental health service provider for the first time, they're not actually offered a genuine choice, a choice regarding understanding that they wish to adopt and inform their care and support plans. Choice is something that it's one of the principles of both person-centered care and trauma-informed recovery. And I just don't think that we're quite there yet, and we're not delivering it systemically. What we have in many Western countries is a health service which operates exclusively from a biomedical, biodeterminist disease model of mental health care. Psychiatry is the dominant framework. There are other alternative frameworks of understanding mental and emotional distress that are just as legitimate. Psychiatry is actually a concept, you know, it's an idea, it's an understanding, and many of us activists go as far as saying that this actually is often a form of social control. And I love psychologists and psychotherapy, and you know, people love DBT and CBT and all of these wonderful things, but I actually just view psychiatry as a it's a construct. It doesn't actually have a massive evidence base, and I think a lot of people think that it does. I'm not convinced. You know, for example, schizophrenia. Most of society holds that dominant framework. It's a severe, enduring, debilitating mental disorder, and it's just accepted as a medical fact. Schizophrenia is classified in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual as organic brain disease. However, according to science, schizophrenia has a construct validity rating of 0. It has a descriptive validity rating of 0. A predictive validity rating of 0, a reliability rating of 0, and an inter-rater reliability rating of 0. That's the science in schizophrenia. Now, psychiatry has just dominated for so long, and it's really attributed this massive level of legitimacy. And it's not my job to go around trying to convince people of how I feel. Everyone is entitled to their own framework. I've got my own. It's a trauma-only framework, which differs from the disease model that does have an acknowledgement to trauma but extrapolates it to something else. And your experiences get pathologized down into symptoms of a disease. You know, I have a different understanding of myself, and I'm entitled to that. This is that I really wanted a mental health service where the clinicians are trained critically. You know, Pat Bracken has done some great work in this field. You know, critical psychiatrists are those who actually go and teach psychiatry students to be critical in their field. So I wanted a system where clinicians are trained critically and are really aware and understand alternative frameworks and can genuinely collaborate. Clinicians are obviously going to have some limitations in policies and procedures because health service reform doesn't happen overnight and it takes decades. So there may be some things they just can't bend. They've got duty of care and risk assessments and all these things. So some things will be limited, but I would love clinicians to bend themselves as much to accommodate somebody else's framework of understanding and all their related choices. And in the least, if it's not possible to bend too much, if a clinician can at least use all the terminology that the consumer has chosen, their language, their words, words and phrases they find empowering and meaningful to them, and that's the language that's used in the therapeutic relationship, then I think that would be a massive step forward. And that's actually not that hard to do. But getting to that point is the massive barrier, because psychiatry is the Western world's most dominant framework. We've been doing the same thing for decades and decades and decades and decades, and it just gets thrown down people's throat as a medical fact, like this is the only understanding, and it's not the only one. So you're quite entitled to sit there and go, well, no, I don't think it's a borderline personality. Oh, I don't think it's schizophrenia. I feel this. And you're not showing me any test results here of anything, so can we go with how I feel, you know? And it just doesn't happen, and it should happen, because that's genuine choice and that's genuine self-empowerment.
When I work with clients and we talk about some of these things like self-harm and some of the unhelpful behaviours they do, you know, I'm often aware that their friends, their families, you know, people, you know, say working with somebody who uses drugs or self-harms or alcohol, and people say, oh, well, it's their choice. And I say, well, it's kind of like a Hobson's choice, because when you self-harm, when you use drugs, when you use alcohol, when you do these things which are unhelpful, you don't have a choice because there's no alternative. And listening to you, I was thinking we could probably take that up. You know, somebody presents to the mental health system and they're told there's a choice, you know, kind of superficially, and we've got the policies and the documentation say the person was offered a choice. But in your experience and the way you framed it, and I think I would agree in many cases, psychiatry is presented as the option, and because there's no awareness of the alternatives, the choice is a Hobson's choice. I've got the medical approach, or I've got nothing. But so I think it's about maybe also educating not just service users and medics, but I was wondering, you know, before people even came into the services, if we looked at schools, we looked at organisations, we looked at the community, and we really did push those psychosocial things. I worked with a very good psychiatrist on an intensive care psychiatric unit. And the first thing she would do is she would get the nursing staff to work on diet, sleep, routine, and activity. And until those things were in place, she wouldn't change the medication. She might give small amounts of medication to help with things like sleep. But the plan was, it was always, I want those basic things in place. I now want you engaging with OT and engaging in therapies. And then we will look at medication, but we're not going to start with medication unless we need to use medication to get you to be able to engage with those things. And it was a really nice model she had, because myself as the psychologist, the OT, the nursing staff, the support time recovery staff, everyone was involved in that individual's care. And there was a plan of saying, we're going to get the basics in place. We're then going to look at this, we're going to look at this. And then if that doesn't change and that doesn't improve, we will look at the medication. But we want to look at the medication from the position where we've addressed the other things as well. And it sounds like
that to me is just, sensible and logical. And this actually leads really nicely on to my second point. The other thing that I would really love to see in WA is open dialogue, this network-centered therapy in all of our services.
You know, okay, if I was a local authority, if I was a government, you know, this is going to cost me so many hundreds of thousands. But how much would I save? How much does it cost when somebody is hospitalized? What's the cost of that care? But what's the social cost of them not working? What's the cost of them as a human being to their family, to their friends, to themselves, to their children? You know, and you start trying to work out, and I really do think that in many things like drugs and alcohol, in mental health, prevention is seen as expensive, but in the long run, it is cheaper than fixing things when they go wrong. And I personally don't think anyone is at school, and when the teacher says, what do you want to be when you grow up, puts their hand up and says, do you know what, I'd like to be a drug user, I'd like to be an alcoholic, I'd like to have mental health difficulties, I'd like to be homeless. I don't believe that this is a choice that anyone makes. And I think
that's why I'm so passionate about WA having a recovery college system. I'm really happy about the model that we've drafted, because I believe that using an educational platform for recovery has got to be the way to go. That's real choice, it's self-empowerment, self-agency, self-actualization, and let's go all the way to self-mastery. I think a lot of our services are offering this, let's get you stable, and we'll keep you maintained, and as long as you're not actually in hospital and you're, you know, at home on your pension and you've got a hobby, that's your recovery outcome. Well, that's just not good enough. That's not genuine. It's not authentic living. There's no positive risk-taking. There's no risk-taking at all. There's no inspiration and zest for life.
It's been lovely to talk to you. Phoebe, that's great. What I'll do is I'll end the recording now.
Thank you so much for this interview, Pat. Thank you.
Phoebe's pleasure. Bye-bye.